Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Reparations and Economics webinar entitled, What Do I Get? This is sponsored by Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. And this is a part of a series of webinars which the church is looking at to grapple with this topic of reparation. We had the last one, or the very first one really, on the 6th of October. And there we were looking at what does God say about reparation? What's the theological grounding for reparation? And so today, which is incidentally Martin Luther King's Day in America, today we're looking at equipping the church so that we can speak boldly, exercise our prophetic voice about reparation and economics. And so this evening we've got three wonderful folks to look at the subject of reparation. First of all, we've got Priya Lukka. Now, Priya is an economist, and she's going to be looking at reparation from an aid and development context. And she will explore whether it is possible that countries with a history of enslavement and exploitation will ever attain a level of real development without some form of reparation. Secondly, we've got Sarah Edwards. Now, Sarah is Executive Director of the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility, a charity that educates Christians and churches about ethical finance and campaigns for tax justice and corporate accountability. She has over 20 years experience in the voluntary sector and holds academic qualifications in social and political science, international political economy and theology. Most recently, she led Tearfund's global advocacy team and were previously with Health, Poverty Action, Jubilee Debt Campaign and Anti-Slavery International. And our third speaker is Karen Campbell. Now, Karen is the person who's doing the praxis, is putting it into practice. And she works as a secretary for global and intercultural ministries with the United Reformed Church. Her recent work includes encouraging the URC on a journey towards being an active anti-racist entity and serving on a task group to help churches engage with the continuing legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. Karen is a church-related community worker, writer, and poet. And so why are we having this particular webinar tonight? And what are we trying to achieve? Well, over the last few years, the issue of reparations has gained real traction in church and society. I'm sure you remember the event of the toppling of the Colston statue in Bristol. And that only served to cast a more probing light into Britain's colonial history and its legacy. From a church perspective, there is clear evidence that they were inextricably involved in both slavery and abolition. That is the church, which means that they have an undoubted role in the reparation debate. As such, many churches and their mission societies are exploring the issue. And so this webinar, this reparations webinar, is sponsored by the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation. It's sponsored by the National Church Leaders Forum, and it's also sponsored by the newly formed Racial Justice Advocacy Forum. And the avowed aim is to encourage people, encourage Christians to really think long and hard about reparations and the church's response to it. And so that's enough from me. We've got our speakers, and they are going to speak for 10 minutes each, and after which we're going to have a debate. And so we're going to invite you to put your questions in the questions and answer. We've got Richard Reddy, who's working behind the scenes. He will be checking your answers, checking your questions rather, and then putting them forward so that we can get answers from them. So do please use the Q&A, and doesn't matter how difficult you think the question might be or easy, I'm sure our panelists will have an answer. And if they haven't got an answer, they will come back to you. We will go away and get an answer for you if you leave your contact details. And so without further ado, let me invite our first speaker, Priya, and she's going to look at reparations. What does it mean in the context of aid and development? Over to you, Priya.
Thanks so much, Alton. Thanks, Karen. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to the team at Churches Together in Britain and Ireland for organising today's event. So I'm going to start off by saying that the whole area of reparations is a long-standing issue, a long-standing cause, a long-standing area of resistance struggles that communities across the world have been pushing forward for, doing tireless years and decades of advocacy on now. So although it's become like much more of a issue that's come into mainstream discussions on social justice more recently, the movement itself is, you know, a very long-rooted one that's rooted in racial justice, one that's rooted in the struggles of all oppressed minorities and marginalized people across the world. So to start off, like, you know, just recognizing, you know, the reason that we kind of open up into a discussion on reparations, there is now, you know, a real recognition, especially in the aid and development sector, that although the formal colonial period ended in the mid-late 20th century, the relations and the institutions and the ways of knowing and being and doing that emerged then are still very much pervasive and very much the framework and the kind of way in which the international system operates. So from that period, what we've seen is a kind of, you know, a power dynamic that's sustained today, and it's enabled the kind of systems of power that underpin colonialism to continue. And this extends into kind of the inequality and the picture of inequality that we see today, which I'm going to touch on a little bit as well. And this, of course, then is kind of, you know, reinforced by the kind of heteronormative ideals and norms that we have the economy built around. And this is all important because we see actually in these current times, in this moment, coming out with the world emerging from the worst pandemic effects and, you know, different countries faring in a very different way, we actually see a visibilization of the inequality and the exclusion and the injustice that was there way before COVID as well. But also, you know, in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, what we've seen is power and race, power asymmetries and race really become very much at the forefront of social justice struggles. And actually the different impacts and the divergence of impacts of COVID-19 on Black, Brown communities, other marginalized groups, Indigenous groups, has really shown us what deep inequalities there are between countries and within countries. And this increase in attention on the nature of racism has led to many development organizations, many social justice organizations to really think about what their own practices are, what their own ambitions are, what their own advocacy causes are. And it's almost created a space to kind of, you know, think about the idea of reparations. Reparations for what? Reparations to who? Is reparations an argument to consider in the context of aid? And, you know, this goes alongside a discussion that's very vibrant now in the sector on decolonization. But I think where the challenge remains is that, decolonization is very, has many similarities and overlaps with already existing areas like loss and damage in the context of climate change, localization in the context of humanitarian practice. But decolonization is really part of reparations. They go together. And I think, giving signing up to a decolonization agenda without considering the difficult journey that is to kind of really consider wholeheartedly and, with full openness and intellectual curiosity what the issue of reparations means for the aid sector is to kind of really do the whole issue a disservice. And actually what we're seeing now is real political traction as well. At the end of last year, the long-standing case for reparations now has finally received formal recognition in the formation of an all-party parliamentary group on African reparations, of which there'll be much exciting work ahead, much needed work ahead as well. So when we think about reparations and why it's important for aid, why it's important for development overall, as I mentioned, resistance movements have gone through massive struggles in the last couple of years. Communities are now looking for acknowledgement of the historical harms, and by that, I mean that there are marginalized communities that continue to endure deprivation, whilst those countries that colonized them grew wealthy and have had the resources to develop things like a human rights apparatus, resilience mechanisms, and adaptability. So what we see is that colonialism has left a very different institutional legacy in different parts of the world, and that's had profoundly divergent consequences for economic development and inequality. I think if we try and understand these historically derived impacts, what it leads us to is really to center the vision and the leadership of people with lived experience of these harms, and the importance in the sector then becomes to amplify the work of those grassroots movements who are calling for reparations. But the focus on why reparations is needed is also something that is really, very visible now in today's context, but often gets overlooked in kind of traditional inequality kind of analysis. So if you look at the links between race and poverty, and this is where a lot of my work has focused, within most ethnically diverse societies, it is mostly ethnic minorities, people of color, and certain groups, racial groups, that are overrepresented in exclusion data on a range of different measures. And people of color are also overrepresented in poverty indicators, particularly rural health, maternal health in many least developed countries. And then you also see that people of color own significantly fewer assets, particularly land, and have less market access, and climate change as well affects people of color in disproportionate ways. So what the case for reparations, I would say, is that what could we achieve if we really shifted more power, more resources and decision-making into the hands of racially excluded communities who've been enduring this historical deprivation? And I'd say that without tackling these areas, people who are descendants of slavery and colonialism will continue to be uncompensated. So, this overlaps with the current time as we're coming out of COVID. We're seeing a number of groups now who are severely disadvantaged by the economic consequences of the measures adopted in a number of countries to contain the virus. What the pandemic has done is really exposed and actually reinforced existing inequalities from healthcare to tech, faced by vulnerable populations, like particularly informal workers, migrant workers, people with disabilities. So we really need alternative plans for recovery that can, amongst other things, expand economic rights and make economies fairer with redistribution policies in place. And redistribution means reparations. Redistribution means reversing the huge transfer of resources that were lost by countries from expropriation, from exclusion, from theft, and really reversing those resources that have drained those countries. And the Global South really needs those funds. The impact of COVID has really put a big pressure on Global South governments for fast structural transformation, for higher growth, in order to pay for all of the different things that are needed, public sector development, health system development. So, you know, instead of kind of thinking about the solutions to where the world has, you know, certain critical points of need in terms of further aid and further debt, the time now is really to think about reparations. So I'll leave it there. And I guess I'll end by just saying that, you know, there are a lot of legal mechanisms to bring about restorative justice and reparations. And I think it is really, you know, although a very, you know, complicated and complex area, there are, you know, so many different examples of where reparations is happening all over the world, at state level in the US, in so many different contexts, where we don't always hear about the kind of particulars of the learning that we can kind of really listen to and learn from to help galvanize our own movements and our own thinking. And this is, again, about hopeful alternatives and building kind of, you know, also parallel institutions outside of the norm, outside of the mainstream organization of the neoliberal system as well. And that too is reparations. So I'll end there and thank you again. It's such a great panel to be part of.
Thank you so much, Priya. You raised quite a few points, and we would really encourage those who are listening to put their questions in the Q&A. I've got some questions for you, which hopefully we will address when it comes to the question time. So get yourself ready for that. And I also saw in the chat someone coming in from Kenya. So I just want to welcome those who are joining us from abroad, from the Caribbean, from Kenya, from Europe, from the diaspora, everyone and anyone who is interested in this subject. Now, our next speaker, Sarah Edwards, she will be looking at, among other things, she'll be exploring whether monies within the financial system, i.e. banking, investments and savings, so on, can be used as a way of making repair, especially in the area of social justice. And so, Sarah, I'm going to ask you now to come and present your case. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Alton, and thanks, Priya, for that opening contribution. It's great to be part of this conversation and really good to have this opportunity. I'm going to make a few comments, as you say, more sort of focused in, I suppose, on the financial system, some of the economic issues and some of the ways in which slavery and colonialism have played their part in shaping the financial system and how we can think about reparations in that context. But first, I just want to acknowledge, I suppose, as we've heard, this is a huge topic, a really broad topic, but also a very personal one for each of us. It's not just an academic discussion. And obviously for me, as a white person, I need to acknowledge a position of privilege in the context of this particular conversation. And so I really want to just state that and get that out there and acknowledge that and recognize that for me in this conversation, I want to be listening and learning as much as anything and hearing from you all as well. So again, just a real honor to be part of this. Another thing which I was reflecting on as Priya was talking, another aspect of how this is a holistic issue is that we can't look at the structures and the systems of money and finance and the economy in isolation. And one of the ways actually that the powerful seek to maintain the status quo is by trying to strip systems and structures of their history, of their political context, even spiritual context, and so that they seem to be normal, so that they seem to have always been, and any problems that we may face in the world are purely technical. And we really need to challenge that and understand that when we're talking about making repair, part of that is telling the truth, telling the whole story of how the world is the way it is. And history didn't start after the Second World War, it didn't start after colonialism, and the free market ideology that we're living with now isn't the way that people have always organized themselves. Just, you know, just picking a few things. So for me personally, I've again, it's interesting to reflect on how much things have changed. When I first came to these issues, when I was working at Anti-Slavery International almost 20 years ago, and actually working with Richard Reddy in the run-up to the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade in 2007, and trying to talk about, as Alton, you said at the beginning, that tension for churches in the UK of having played a role in abolition and also having played a role in slavery. And that's the human condition, isn't it? That's the reality that we recognise as Christians. But at that point, there was not a willingness to engage in the darker side of the church's complicity, of British complicity in the history of slavery and colonialism. We wanted to celebrate abolition, abolitionists, William Wilberforce, and we wanted to maybe talk about things like human trafficking. We didn't want to really engage in some of those more difficult issues. We certainly didn't want to talk about reparations. And now, having come to head up ECCR, which is a charity helping Christians and churches in the UK think about money and finance, how we can use our money for good, it's actually amazing that you can't have that conversation now without talking about race. And I think it's fair to say that we are starting to see that you can't have that conversation without a bit of history and understanding of how the finance system has been shaped, although I think there's still a long way to go. So in terms of the financial system, and as we've heard, the whole of modern industry capitalism, the whole way in which the economy is shaped has been, there's so much of slavery and colonialism that shaped trade, the creation of cities, business, law, and of course finance is at the heart of it. And so I just want to mention a few examples, I guess. Many banks and financial institutions who benefited from slavery, from the slave trade, from colonialism, continue to hold wealth and power at the heart of our economy today. So there are people and institutions, and you can trace them back to that history. And I'd recommend the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery at UCL as one source. There are lots of experts out there, but they've done some brilliant work, and you can actually search their databases online for different companies and see how that history forms the economy today. The Bank of England, along with many other financial institutions, played a critical role in financing, providing collateral, providing credit and wealth for the slave trade, for slavery, and drove the institutionalization of transatlantic slavery and colonialism. And so there are specific people and companies, therefore, that need to unearth those connections and to think about what it looks like to make repair. And I'll talk about a couple of examples of those in a minute. Secondly, as we've heard and as Priya talked about, the whole global economy has been shaped by slavery and colonialism. And I wanted to quote American historian Ibram Kendi, who said, "The origins of racism cannot be separated from the origins of capitalism." And we can clearly see that the finance system and economy that was built at that time of slavery and colonialism is at the historical root of racial inequalities today. And whether we're looking at all kinds of issues, but in particular in terms of finance, access to financial products and services, lower levels of savings and assets, representation and pay in the finance sector. These are some of the live issues today that can be traced back. And I also just wanted to mention one thing in terms of tax and tax justice, because I want to talk about that in a moment. Some of those Caribbean island slave economies were then under colonial control and then turned into the offshore finance centres that are those tax havens where trillions of dollars is being hidden today by the wealthy to entrench those same global inequalities. There's this kind of cycle of global inequalities through history that you can trace. And so tax is really, and tax avoidance actually is very much at the heart of that. And then I just wanted to mention as well that, of course, we know that reparation was made the wrong way around. Compensation was paid to slave owners. And I was really interested, I read a blog from Tax Justice Network. The British government borrowed £20 million to compensate slave owners, which at that time was about 5% of GDP. And that was one of the largest loans in history. And it was only in 2015 that British taxpayers finished paying off that debt, which had been incurred to compensate British slave owners in the 1830s. So if you've paid tax in the UK before 2015, you have contributed to paying that compensation. And so there's a disgrace and a horror at that, but it's also interesting that actually there's a helpful precedent in some ways that there has been reparation made. So we could look at doing it in the right way, in a just way. So as I say, I wanted to mention a couple of examples of how those sorts of ways in which we have this complex and deeply troubled history. How do we respond? What might reparation look like? So in terms of those individual banks and financial institutions, as I say, there's a role for them to play. And we have seen, particularly since 2020, some breakthroughs. Before that, really, you're looking to the United States. There wasn't really much in the UK context. And I am talking from the UK context. So, I appreciate that's a narrow lens. But the Bank of England, for example, did make a kind of limited apology for the role of some of its former directors and members in the slave trade and slavery. That was in 2020. They weren't willing to acknowledge any institutional culpability. Lloyd's of London, on the other hand, has apologised for its role in the slave trade, has made a series of commitments to make financial contributions to racial justice charities and to increase ethnic minority staffing and a number of other things. I'd be really interested in people's responses and thoughts on that kind of action that's been taken. As individuals, as I say, ECCR looks to help people understand the finance system and how they can play a role within it. So we have a programme called Money Makes Change. And one of the things we can do as people with bank accounts and many of us with pensions through our workplaces is actually contact those financial institutions and ask them what they're doing. Have they investigated their links to historic slavery? Have they looked at what they might be doing about that? Have they published data? For example, just one small thing, have they published ethnic pay data, and what are they doing about addressing any gaps in that? And then finally, I wanted to just talk about tax justice. We do need a systemic response as well. We're not just looking for individual banks and institutions to respond. And we have a tax justice, the Church Action for Tax Justice campaign is hosted in ECCR, which is calling for an end to tax havens and a much fairer tax system. And we helped with a project that some of you may well be familiar with, the ZAC Tax project, which was an initiative of the World Council of Churches and others, which really looked at tax justice through a reparation lens. And you can really see the way in which wealth taxes and tackling tax avoidance and evasion can really be seen as a way of making repair. So those are some of the ways in which I've hopefully traced some connections in the finance sector in particular to slavery and colonialism, and then how repair might be made. But I'm really interested to hear and explore and listen to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much, Sarah. We're going to come back to you with there's some questions coming in already. Just keep the questions coming in the Q&A. We will, after our next speaker, Karen, comes to us, we will start to answer or attempt to answer those questions. Okay, so, and those of you who joined late, this webinar is being recorded and it will be on the CTBI, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland's website tomorrow. So you will be able to go and look at it again and have a look at some of the suggestions that's been made, okay? And we're so grateful for CTBI for hosting this webinar for us, okay? And now we're going to turn to Karen Campbell. And now Karen will discuss the journey URC has taken over the last few years regarding reparation. And hopefully she will explain to us their involvement in the World Council of Churches mission activities in this area. Over to you, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Alton. Thank you. And I'm so happy right now because I've heard the overlaps between some of what I will share and what Priya has shared and what Sarah has shared. So we are on the same page. So that's good. And I think I'll start by saying that I'm speaking tonight as the United Reformed Church Secretary for Global and Intercultural Ministries, but I'm also speaking very much as myself, as Karen Campbell, a British-born Black individual. And I'll try to be clear if and where those two identities may give rise to differing or as yet unreconciled perspectives, because I am an individual as well as a member and employee of my church. So the United Reformed Church, the URC, is currently on a journey of engagement with the legacies of transatlantic slavery. And that journey really began in a focused way back in 2017, when we were first involved with the Council for World Missions Legacies of Slavery project. The project saw delegates from the various CWM regions engaging in a series of hearings in specific locations of significance in transatlantic slavery. And the project was seeking to uncover not just the history of slavery in those locations, but the continuing impacts and legacies for the respective communities today. And I was asked to be part of the URC delegation, which helped to organize a London hearing. And I was then invited to attend a second hearing in Ghana. Further hearings took place in Jamaica and in the US. Now the CWM project ended in 2019, having uncovered legacies of persistent and structural inequality, racism, and underdevelopment experienced by many African and African diaspora communities. And again, that is reflecting what Priya and Sarah have both just been sharing with us. The London hearing also shone a light on some of the hidden aspects of history right here in the UK. And with the publication of the report, CWM's member churches were invited to actively engage with the project findings. And the URC appointed a task group to consider the issues and make recommendations to the church under 3 headings drawn from the CWM report. The first heading was apology. Should the URC consider making an apology, not just for the role of its antecedent bodies in the transatlantic slavery, not for their complicity in transatlantic slavery, but also for our continuing role in maintaining or failing to dismantle the legacies of transatlantic slavery today. It's not just history, it's now, it's right now. The second heading was reparations. Should the URC consider making some form of reparation in response to what we've discovered through the CWM project and through other spheres? If no, why not? But if yes, what might such reparations look like? That's a question we've already heard tonight, and I'll come back to it. And thirdly, the CWM report highlighted the issue of white privilege as the factor which underpins and maintains the injustices of the status quo. So how might the URC seek to engage with this issue in a meaningful way? Is white privilege at work in the United Reformed Church? If yes, where and how, and what could we do about it? Sorry, excuse me. The task group was small, so as not to be cumbersome, but yet it was still very diverse. In its 8 members, it included white members and Black members, African and Caribbean backgrounds, women and men, lay and ordained members. I was part of the group from its inception, although I was not yet employed in my present role. And I'm going to tell you the truth. There were some frank conversations. There were some awkward conversations. There were diverse views shared. There was agreement and there was disagreement. But together, we came to the recommendation that yes, the URC should issue a corporate apology. Yes, we should consider some form of reparations, some visible outworking of the words professed in the apology. And yes, we should embark on a journey of understanding, uncovering, and dismantling white privilege in our church and in our communities. These were the recommendations of the URC's Legacies of Slavery Task Group, and we are now currently engaged in a process of consultation with the wider church. It's not all sewn up, it's a work in progress. If all goes to plan, we hope to bring concrete resolutions to the URC General Assembly in July this year. But I'm going to backtrack a little. Back to that word, reparations. What do we mean? What might reparations look like? And what is in it for whom? These questions are key, I think, because I know that some people balk at the word reparations. The task group used the word, and we're happy to use the word, not least because this was the terminology coming out of those communities who are still experiencing the negative legacies of transatlantic slavery. But we have met with resistance. Wouldn't restorative justice be a better term? And I find myself asking, better for whom and better how? For some people, the problem seems to be the association of reparations with money, paying back what has been taken, letting go of money which we now consider to be our money, however unjustly that money may have been accrued. And we're afraid to go there, or we're unwilling to go there. We're unwilling to let go of what we have. Personally, I have no problem with the word reparations. To me, it speaks of trying to repair. Damage has been done. Repairs are needed. For me, reparations does speak of money, but it speaks of far more than just money. It speaks of intent, conviction, giving meaning to our words. The task group drew on the Bible to inform our thinking, the story of Zacchaeus being a key text. This man who, in response to Jesus' love, voluntarily sought to repay so much more than he had taken, so much more than was required by law, to those he had cheated. We know what the recipients got. What was in it for Zacchaeus? And the fact is, the URC, the UK even, could never repay what has been lost by Africa and her diaspora community. It's not possible. There is no sum big enough and no sum we could afford, but we can make some effort, financially and otherwise, seeking to put right what has been so wrong for way too long. Money, yes, because money matters. Money mattered enough for Britain to compensate the former slave owners for their loss of property when slavery was abolished. Money matters today because debt and poverty and unjust tax systems, as we heard, maintain the global picture of injustice. Money matters because it can enable projects and initiatives and new beginnings. I was quite intrigued to hear Sarah just mentioning about a project that's saying about how money can bring about change. Exactly. But it's money and money in order that. More recently, the URC task group has adopted the term repairing justice rather than reparations, and has come up with a number of possibilities to be implemented at different levels. Now, these possibilities, these ideas include, at a URC level, strengthening our relationships with our CWM partner churches in the Caribbean and our 2 Ghanaian partner churches in London. Developing and delivering an education program to include topics such as white privilege, racism, what it means to be an actively anti-racist church, fostering positive Black self-image, restoring Black people's confidence in their unqualified worth, repentance and forgiveness. And right now in the URC, we're exploring how we might implement a program of affirmative action to specifically address the underrepresentation of Black and ethnic minority colleagues in senior leadership positions in the church. At a UK level, the task group is suggesting perhaps some form of campaigning, encouraging the government to look at a 10-point action plan that was put together by the CARICOM community in the Caribbean. You know, their action plan with regard to reparations. Campaigning to encourage the government to release legacies of slavery countries and communities from debt owed to the UK, to increase aid for those countries and communities, and to support positive Black self-image programs. And for those legacies of slavery countries and communities themselves, we're suggesting perhaps working with our partner denominations in those regions to improve literacy and healthcare, to work towards reduction in deprivation, to foster positive Black self-image programs. In addition to the task group with suggestions, we're asking URC congregations, what might reparations look like where you are? What might be undertaken to make a difference in your community? The URC consultation, as I said earlier, is very, very much a work in progress. We haven't reached. I don't yet know the final version of whatever will go to General Assembly in July. I have even less idea of what might come out of Assembly in response. There has been pushback. There will be protest. But so far, this is far outweighed by the positive responses and the genuine requests for more information and deeper understanding. And as I consider all of these issues, I think to myself, I have to do some understanding. I have to understand that although I am a Black woman born and raised in Britain, I'm only just making sense of so much of what I've seen and experienced and negotiated throughout my whole life. Why? Because my lived experience of the legacies of slavery was such that I learned to accept the status quo as being the norm. I think Priya made mention of that kind of a backdrop in her presentation. Most of my life, I've accepted this norm without particularly challenging the norm or questioning how it came to be. It just was. And while I have now been journeying with the idea of URC reparations for 2 years, for many URC members, legacies of slavery is still a brand new idea. And the notion of reparations is hard to get their heads around. What? Why? When? Who? What is this all about? So I realized that I have to have patience and I need to have grace. But I confess that I also have impatience and I have resilience and I have determination. And we'll have to work and pray and see how things go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Fantastic, wonderful. Okay, now we're going to hopefully pin all the panelists on the screen. And we're now going to have a time of questions. We've got about 40 minutes. We had some 11 questions in the chat. So I wonder if we can do that. Richard, just pin everyone on the screen. Let me just change my camera. Okay, and then we're going to just answer the questions. So the first question I'm going to answer was directed to me, actually. And it says, let me just read, the question was from, what's the connection between missionary work and colonialism and racial inequality? And also let me welcome folks who came in from Geneva and also Puerto Rico. So this webinar has spread very, very widely. So let me answer this question and then we'll move on to other questions. What's the connection between missionary work and colonialism and racial inequality? Let me just answer that by saying in 1857, David Livingstone, Dr. Livingstone, he was given a speech in Cambridge. And he said the purpose of Britain was to spread colonialism, Christianity, and capitalism. And that's exactly what the missionaries did then. And unfortunately, that is only now being addressed by churches like the URC, who are recognizing the evil and the wrongs that they did. Okay, let's turn over to Priya now. Priya, there's a question for you. It says, what should aid agency be doing in regards to reparation? That question is from an anonymous attendee. Over to you, Priya.
So I think one of the things that I mentioned was that there seems to be a kind of openness to thinking about decolonization issues, and yet still a real hesitation to kind of openly consider and be curious into kind of what the implications of reparations would mean for aid agencies. And maybe that's partly because, you know, reparations is seen as something, you know, so alternative to the mainstream kind of issues that we work on, or the mainstream ways in which we advocate through the multilateral system for change, that it's difficult to kind of think about, you know, where can you open up into a reparations agenda, or how do you kind of, you know, collate kind of, you know, how do you start thinking about campaigning on this issue, or how do you, where do you even begin? Do you begin in your own geography? Do you think about like the harm caused in the context of the country programs where there's a presence? And I would say, you know, it is the reparations journey for aid organizations, I think, should be really unique and you know, contextual to the kind of history of the organization in you know, in each case, where there are organizations that have a faith basis and a particular history. There's a different kind of journey to explore in terms of kind of what reparations can mean uniquely to the culture of that organization, what its leadership has meant, what its early work in context of possible mission work might have meant. And all of these questions are part of kind of, as Karen described, as Sarah made reference to, as we've seen in, you know, lots of settings of really courageous work where, you know, really big institutions, really big organizations have opened themselves up to a slavery and legacies from slavery process, and kind of, you know, really held themselves open to accountability and transparency. And I think that's, you know, the next kind of, you know, maybe journey that, you know, maybe some aid organizations will want to start thinking about. And I think, you know, if the whole kind of, you know, exposing the kind of structural kind of philosophies and structural kind of principles is too much, I think a very obvious kind of starting place is really joining in solidarity to reparations movements across the world, building synergies between those causes and other social justice causes where there is, you know, very, very strong alignment in particular areas, you know, definitely in the kind of fight back towards neoliberal sovereign debt, which has become the anchor of the kind of power dynamic and power asymmetry between the North and the South. And that is very much a reparations area, very big reparations policy area today is debt. And I'd say, you know, signaling political support where aid organizations feel that they're able to, funding grassroots movement building, and really amplifying messages. And then, you know, going back to kind of what I said when I opened up, I do really think that it is important to center the leadership of people with lived experience of harm from the system that perpetuates exclusion and expropriation and exploitation. And I think until we have, you know, that kind of leadership really reflected in aid organizations, there's still a them and us that kind of pervades the culture and defines the culture in a way. So there are, you know, smaller steps and then bigger transformations ahead as well.
Karen, sorry, Priya, can I ask you, you know, the language that folks are using in terms of aid and third world and developed country. Now, Willie Jennings, who is a professor in America, he says that in itself is problematic because it automatically tells folks that those who are in the 2/3 world or 2/3 majority they are the ones who are in the underdeveloped world. So do you think that even the language of aid, in terms of aid from a developed to an underdeveloped, do you think that should be transformed or changed? And if so, what to?
Absolutely, Alton. I really, my heart is definitely committed to kind of a transformation of the real frames of development are so subjugating and so oppressive. And I think, we really know, we should know better. We should be talking to empowerment language and empowerment frames throughout, and rejecting the language of multilateralism that classifies and homogenizes huge populations just generally outside of this debate. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that the steps towards kind of redefining and really naming communities for their origins, their beauty, their culture, and not simply labeling them as poor or least developed or underdeveloped, which is even worse. And part of the problem is that this is part of the development industry, part of the kind of lexicon of what it means to be a participant in this bigger system. But I think the change comes from those of us that are working to kind of re-envision, and that again is the very essence of kind of holistic reparations, as Sarah was saying as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me just say that someone asked me the question, can there be reparation without reconciliation, or basically looking at going toward reconciliation? Let me just say that reparation is on the reparatory justice model that I subscribe to. Start with repentance, that's what Karen was saying, you apologize, you turn away, and then restitution, which is reparation. If you want a biblical model for that, look in Luke 19, that Karen so aptly mentioned. Zacchaeus, he said, if I've wronged people, I'll give them back up to 4 times what I've taken from them. And Zacchaeus was a Jewish guy and very clever, but the biblical Old Testament says you should pay back, when the thief is caught, he should pay back 7 times. But he said he would pay back up to 4 times. So reparation and repairing as well is to do about repairing that which was broken. And in fact, our next webinar will be about education and how we repair ourselves through education. And so we're going to go over to Sarah now. Sarah, I'm going to link 2 questions for you. The first one is, can reparation be anything other than a sticky plaster whilst capitalism is the accepted paradigm? And the second question, that's from Mark Meacher. And the second question is, how far back do we go in terms of making amends for the past? Over to you, Sarah.
Wow, just some small questions there. I mean, I think in terms of the capitalist system we live in is a particular neoliberal model of capitalism, which is completely enthralled to the market. And what we're talking about, partly what we could be talking about in terms of some of these policies that I've mentioned, is embedding that capitalist economy within the kinds of values that we want to adhere to as a society. So that's part of the conversation, isn't it? If we want to seek justice, reconciliation, we've just talked about, making repair for past damages, how can the market, the trade in goods and services between people, serve that greater end? How can we have an economy that we're not, that's not over us, that's not the overlord, but that actually serves the kind of world that we want to see? And as Christians, I mean, one of the things that I often come back to is the idea from Walter Wink of the principalities and the powers that are talked about in Scripture include companies, businesses, banks, financial institutions. We can see these things as perhaps having the potential for good, but often really not, often being, I mean, he talks about things being created good fallen, but redeemable. And so can we perhaps see capitalism and the institutions of capitalism in that pattern? There's the potential for good there. There's the potential to have the market serve us and serve the kind of world that we want to see. But at the moment, that really isn't the case. So what is it? How is it that those institutions and those markets can be redeemed? In terms of how far back do we go, I almost don't want to answer this question myself. It's for, there are people, if we listen, if we as white people listen to people who are still living the hurts of the legacies of slavery and colonialism, we need to make that repair as long as there are people who are hurting from those legacies. And so that's not my judgment call, actually. That's for us to open the conversation and sit back and listen and see how far back that takes us.
Okay, let me now go over to Karen. Karen, a couple of questions here for you. The first one is, what's the situation in the Caribbean? Do you know about it in terms of what they're doing? And would you, second question, would the panel recommend reparation to be offered to people in less developed, there's that word again, less developed countries who have been disadvantaged by slavery, or to people who are descendants of slavery in the more developed countries that have benefited from slavery? And how much is enough to make adequate reparations, as any amount could seem to be grossly inadequate for harm done? Karen, can you take that, Karen? Unmute yourself.
Yeah. I think with regard to the question about the Caribbean, I wouldn't try to comment, because although I sort of dipped my toe in that water at the time of looking at the CARICOM report and so on, but it's not fresh in my mind. So I can't honestly say I know what is happening. I would need to go and find out. So I can't speak about that off the top of my head. With regard to the reparations, I think, me personally, I think reparations really are needed in all of those contexts being referred to, because I think certainly when we went to, when we had the hearing, the CWM hearing in Ghana, the folks in Ghana, actually, they were talking about being rendered underdeveloped, because slavery stripped out their youngest and fittest and left them unable to develop in the ways that they would have been able to develop had they been left alone. And so they were seeing a void, or not across the board, and because I know that one of the issues that we have is that so much of our imagery of Africa is about they're poor and needy, and we need to help them, and we need to pity them and all of that. Not that, but a reality of our youngest and fittest and strongest were taken, and which created a vacuum. And there is an issue, and the vacuum still continues because their youngest and fittest are drained away into these developed countries to go and trying to earn a living or to shore up the systems in those developed countries. So there is something going on there in Africa. And then again in the Caribbean, there are communities who are, they are disadvantaged, then let me say, disadvantaged or struggling or in poverty and so on. And so there is clearly things that need to be done, intervention that could be done. But then similarly, in the UK, and I'm sure in the US and in other places where there is African diaspora communities, where I forget, was it Priya who was saying earlier on about wherever, those communities who are from, who hail from situations of colonialism and slavery, wherever we are, wherever people of color are, tend to be at the bottom of the pile financially, in terms of ownership of resources and assets and all that kind of stuff. Bottom of the pile in terms of, falling foul of criminal justice and all of those kinds of things. So clearly there's something going on. So I would say that there's reparations needed across the board, really.
Right. I'm going to ask Priya to think about this question before you come, because I'm just going to ask a couple of questions in the Q&A. The question is, you know, in terms of reparation, where do reparation payments stop? And do you include those nations who were in America before the Europeans arrived? So think about that one while I answer these other questions. Now, Derek Morgan says in the question and answer, today is Martin Luther King's Day in America. I did mention that earlier. Would Martin Luther King be supportive of reparation? Derek, definitely, because initially Martin Luther King was trying to get the vote. He was trying to get universal suffrage in America, and then he was anti-war, and he was all for to end racial injustice. And remember his famous term, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Okay, so let's answer your question, Derek. One more question. I think Karen was saying, you see, this is from Elizabeth Joy to Karen. Karen, you see reparation with money and it matters. Thanking you. What is your opinion of reparation as debt cancellation, where it is seen more as compensation than as debt? I think Priya actually answered that one. Debt cancellation is one of the actual, is one of the things that Priya mentioned. And then another question, Margaret Seaton says, I have a particular concern where our young people are marginalized in the educational system. Therefore, I'd like to see funds provided so that we can set up our own colleges to address the need of our young people. How can we move for this, to achieve this? I think, Margaret, one of the things that Glasgow University has done, they're actually set aside £20 million, and they're working with the University of the West Indies to offer scholarship to people with a Caribbean heritage for what they've done. So in terms of setting up our own institutions, I think that is being done as well. Black Boys Can, they're called Excel now. They've set up the King Solomon School in Birmingham, and there are others, the Seventh-day Adventists. There are many, many schools which are run and operated by Black teachers and so on. So there are lots of educational institutes which are set up. However, I think within the mainstream schooling system, we need to decolonize that. So Priya, you're going to come forward now and answer that question that I posed, and also give us an example of how we decolonize an institution, if you can. Over to you, Priya.
What was the question again, Alton? You want me to look at the education one?
I want you to, just talk about the decolonization. And the question was debt cancellation, and did we ask this question about where does the payment stop? i.e., that's the one. Do we include the people in America before the Europeans arrived? To be fair, I think the Americans are making reparations to the American Indians, aren't they? Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's, just reading the stream, there's such an interesting range of probes and kind of just interest in kind of, would reparations be defined in this way? Would this be included? What would be the approach? And it's just so indicative of the vibrant debate that is there this evening amongst us in this global community, and the sharing that's there in all of those people who are in the social justice movement, in movements across the world, and who are drawn to this idea of reparations. And I guess what I would say is that I don't think it's on part of any one individual to kind of define what reparations is or what's included within the remit of reparations. My understanding of it is that, as Karen described, it is a community-owned process. So it has to involve a legitimacy that is derived right from an authentic grassroots kind of involvement in designing and setting up the process for determining how reparations would apply, how they would be determined, what they would mean, what their intent would mean, and how they would be practically administered, be that within a country, towards an educational fund, towards the future. And I really like the comment, to say, can we kind of, look towards the future, which is, I think, essentially the whole spirit of the reparations, implication or the intent is to be hopeful, to reverse the drain of what slavery, transatlantic slavery and colonialism, European colonialism caused, and to kind of, give back to the communities that have historically endured this marginalization. But I think there is an aspect which is, yes, all of this has to be, part of, a robust community consultation exercise that is, very authentically led by reparationists, by people within the community, the scholars in the community who have, spent tireless amounts of, time in kind of telling us, and educating us about kind of how reparations has, first evolved and how it's become part of like the legal mechanism recognized the UN, now with the APPG on African reparations. And so these are all like really important aspects to kind of think about, and kind of where do you start with reparations?
Okay. Karen, should reparations be negotiated by governments or communities? You've been talking on behalf of the URC, and yeah, give us your answer. Don't give me a yes or no answer.
No, was not going to do that.
Okay.
I was going to agree with something that Priya said a little while ago, which is that it needs to be authentic. I think it needs to come from the communities. I think it needs to be people need to be able to say for themselves what it is that they need, and to determine for themselves what they need in order to progress, to move forward, to feel fully themselves. So while I think that the government certainly has a role to play, but I don't think it should be about the government devise something and impose it. I think it should be about the government listening and being in conversation and trying to work with communities to implement what communities say that they need.
Okay, and Sarah, how would we ensure that reparations in monetary terms get to the right people and it wasn't paid to governments who, some of whom are, inverted commas, corrupt?
So if we're talking about monetary reparations, I mean, I agree with what Karen and Priya have been saying. There's a community engagement, which is not just about an initial community engagement and then disappearing, but actually throughout the process, there needs to be community ownership and community oversight. And you see that in actually the best kind of, to use that word, development projects as well, where it's the people themselves who are best placed to understand what they need and to oversee the process of the dissemination of funds as well, and to ensure that it doesn't end up in the pockets of some corrupt official. I do want to challenge that narrative a bit, because I think it's really important that we recognise when we're talking about corruption, we're talking about, by and large, global elites, as much in the UK and in the US as in Africa. We're not talking about those people over there who are more corrupt than us people over here. That is just, frankly, racist, and we need to name that. And so we need to recognise that, yeah, there are processes, and it's about community ownership, whether it's money being spent here or in other parts of the world.
Right. And coming back to you again, Sarah, Solomon Brown, he's got a fairly long question. Let me just try and praise it. He said that, why can't reparations be simply investment in education, health system, economic justice project, etc.? Why do you need monetary terms? I think he's alluded to. Sarah?
So I think all of those things can be reparations, but reparations is more than that. And so, I mean, Karen talked about the process with the URC of coming together, of awkward, frank conversations, of working it out in the messiness, and the understanding, the element of understanding, I suppose. I'm reminded of the Sankofa bird in sort of traditional African art, of the bird that's flying forwards but looking backwards, and that idea that to know, and this picks up on something else someone said about, don't we need to be looking to the future? Yes, but to go forward, we need to understand the past. And so to, yes, invest in those things that's been listed there, whether it's education, youth work provision, or overseas aid, all of those things, yes, but coming out of an understanding of where we've come from in order to make repair for that harm and that damage.
Okay. Karen, in terms of your work with the URC in trying to implement reparation and so on, you know, amongst the communities that's benefited from that, can you give us a little insight about, you know, the sort of work you've done on reparatory justice and how you've actually implemented that on the ground? And how has the churches, you know, taken on to that in terms of even changing their language that they use in that context?
Okay, I think I'll just say again that our work so far, I would say we're still at the beginning. We're at the mouth, we're at the gateway of this work. So the task group has been in existence since 2019 and has changed members and brought different people on board and so on. And so the task group has been journeying with this for a couple of years. We have had conversations with different committees and so on along the way, including a previous, not the General Assembly, but a meeting which has the delegated powers of General Assembly. So it has been heard, our initial report and so on, and then it was sort of bounced back to us to do some more work on it. And it's now, but all of that was not, did not involve a whole church sort of consultation. So in a sense, the task group knew about it, and the mission committee, which tasked us with this job, they knew about it, and then it went to Mission Council, and so that grouping knew about it, but it wasn't a whole church kind of awareness, and that's what we're working on now. So so in the past few months, for example, we have regional meetings of the URC called synods. The URC is made up of 13 synods, which covers, England and Scotland and Wales and so on. So at those synod meetings, we've been sharing the information, the journey so far, the vision of the future. We've been disseminating paperwork so that people are more aware and have opportunity to be part of the messy conversations and to engage and so on. There has been a lot of interest, a lot of positive interest. There's a lot of people who are saying this work is so overdue, it's unreal. There are those people who are saying, we had no idea, and we don't, there are some people who are saying, we have no understanding about this, not in a negative sense, but we need to know more. And so we're trying to produce materials and so on, so that people can equip people with those conversations. And of course, there are those people who say, problem, what problem? It's a waste of time, But I'm pleased to report that the majority of people are either positive about it or are asking questions and wanting to understand better. And I think people do have it in their thinking. I think George Floyd's murder made a huge difference. I think COVID has made a huge difference. So people who were not engaging before are now engaging, or are ready to engage, ready to be engaged, and are paying attention. So I think there's an opportunity there, and we're just trying to we're trying to not miss that opportunity, let me say. We're trying not to miss the opportunity, but it's very, very, very much a work in progress.
Excellent. We've got about another 10 minutes left before we conclude. So you either got to speak very quickly or be very concise with your answers. Now, Priya, there's a question in the chat was saying that Al Jazeera did a documentary years ago about the fact that people from the diaspora communities contribute to most overseas aid by sending money back home. And the question basically is, how can we acknowledge this truth and hold the UK government to account to do their part, seeing that recently the UK government was cutting international aid or sending aid to countries that were already rich, like India? Can you answer that one?
I don't know if I will be as, well equipped as the amazing advocates out there who are kind of really fighting the flag for kind of transparency of aid and maintenance of aid and promises to pledges that have been politically made and then, backward steps have been taken. But I think, first of all, the first part of the question, remittances are, a big amount of revenue for countries that are deemed low income by national and worldwide benchmarks. So I would say that, that is an important source of income. But what we've seen in, COVID is kind of this global depression and kind of a reduction in remittances and a reduction in taxes, a reduction in profits in so many countries in the global south. And I think that this at a time when the debt to GDP ratio is growing for these countries, because these countries are now, in kind of a new debt crisis or having to, face newly structured debt because of kind of increasing need for fiscal expansion. And I think that in itself is going to provide a real crunch, and the remittance payments aren't going to be, a kind of a stable source of kind of income for so many countries. So that's a reality to take on board. And whether aid can kind of, can provide enough resource now in this kind of really constrained environment where, there's going to be a real demand going ahead for kind of public investment. We know public investment is going to be high in demand, and therefore there's going to be a need to kind of innovate on kind of what are the options for, creating these public investment kind of vehicles. Will that be aid? I mean, if you look at the political sentiments towards aid and the commitments that are, sort of, becoming very different and kind of, aid being much more closely aligned in the context of defense budgets and foreign investment, it's unlikely that aid is going to be something that is going to be, as was envisaged, 20 years ago, something to support like social protection mechanisms in countries. It's much more, a politically targeted kind of, fund now in how it's applied and how it's allocated. But is that the case, or was it, were we just not so clear on its insidious use 20 years ago? There's that debate as well, that it's always been popping up kind of, foreign exploitation missions and popping up wars and further expansion of the imperialist state or the imperialist multilateral kind of project. And I think that's the thing when you think about kind of all of these like flows, remittances, aid, they're all essentially unsustainable, which is why it brings us back to what is a structural argument to really tackle development today. That is reparations. The multilateral approach is a colonial project, and it really involves the loss of this contextual and embodied knowledge, where knowing is linked to the lived experience of communities, especially communities impacted by climate change. And that visceral kind of understanding of painful losses is completely obscured in the kind of colonial multilateral approach. So the dismantling, from my perspective, from the work that I do, is the dismantling of the coloniality of the multilateral system begins with centering the experiences of people with lived experience of harms, centering the indigenous wisdoms, centering the regenerative ways of being that are practiced by the communities who have been most harmed. So it's not so much just an issue of kind of the funds and their allocation and whether they will continue, and much more kind of a deep examination of the system in which we're working in, when we're thinking, can an aid budget kind of, keep putting a plaster on, countries where, we know that there are just not even basic primary healthcare services to cope with COVID. And we as, participants in this global system have kind of accepted that as, okay, that's an okay level of kind of aspiration to get to. And I think it's up to us as, as citizens armed with so many privileges in kind of our advocacy spaces to reject that in so many ways. And I think for me, that's why reparations is, part of decolonization, but decolonization is not enough on its own as well. Right.
Okay. Wow, we're running out of time. Time's gone by so quickly. And let me just ask this question, and you're just going to answer it very succinctly, all of you. Palmira Ross from Puerto Rico says this: your presentation recognizes the link between colonialism and reparation, which is very good. I'm glad that people are recognizing that. Can you address the centrality to your argument of the continuing colonial status of several territories like Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, to name but a few? Should completing self-determination of all colonies be a demand of the reparations movement? And we noticed recently that Barbados have just become independent. So this is something just to throw at you quickly. Should self-determination and independence be a condition of the reparations movement? Karen.
Interesting. I don't know if I'd say it should be a condition of. I think I can see the aspiration for it, and I've certainly asked the question, how is it that we can have British this and that, or French something else, and it's far removed from the originating place? But I think that it's not as simple and straightforward as saying it should just be cut off, because I think there's a lot of history and the structures and so on that are in place and maintain what is in place. So I think, again, that's probably a conversation with the people in those places and making sure that if and when that independence comes, it comes successfully and well.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, it ties back to the point I was making earlier about the British overseas territories, who many of whom were involved in slavery and slave economies, then were colonies, and then were turned into offshore finance centres. That there are places in the world today that continue not to have been allowed to develop in sustainable ways that have given their people self-determination politically, but also economic freedoms. And so it's really important to recognise those connections. I'm not going to comment on specific political context, because it is for those people, those communities, to determine their own future, but absolutely those connections are there to be made.
Yeah,
just echoing what Karen and Sarah have said, really. And tax havens, as Sarah just said, this is, these are not just isolated kind of liberation instances that we're thinking about. We're thinking about the whole system. We're thinking about wealth taxes. We're thinking about what extorts most of the capital that's not available in the way that it should be. So I think it's more, it's kind of, thinking about where the biggest kind of hindrances to kind of, some of these kind of resource constraints that we're seeing that are such an enormity at the current time as well.
Okay, we are coming down to the end. We've got about 6 minutes before we finish. So I want to give you about a minute or so just to sum up your arguments. And there's a very a question from an anonymous attendee that says, will there be reparation in our lifetime? So in your summing up, if you could conclude by saying yes or no, or whatever. So let's start in reverse order then. Let's start with Karen. You sum up. You've got about a minute or so to sum up and then answer that question, okay? Will there be reparation in our lifetime?
I think I would want to sum up by saying that although this journey that we're on in the URC, it's bumpy, it can hurt, it can be awkward, it can be difficult, but I think it's a journey that we need to be on, no matter what the outcome is. And I keep saying to people that in a sense, it's not that I don't care, but my particular interest isn't where people are starting the journey. It's not even where they finish the journey. It's the fact that they're willing to be on a journey and be on a journey together, because I think that's how we kind of get to try to figure things out. So that's what I'm encouraging people in the URC to do, to be on the journey. That's what I would think I'd encourage other churches who are thinking about it to step and see where it takes you, because if you don't start walking, you don't know where you're going to get to. And
Right.
And I think with regards to will we see reparations in our lifetime, we will see reparations, just which reparations, at what stage and for who. So there will be reparations, but for who and what.
Okay, Sarah, you got a minute.
No pressure. I think so for ECCR, we really want to help people understand the role of money and finance in the economy, and clearly that has is so connected to slavery and colonialism. The financial system that we have today has been shaped by that. And yet there are ways in which we can engage with the finance system as individuals and campaign on things like tax justice, as we've just been saying, where we can see money make a change for good. So I think I'd end with a theological point, I suppose, which is that we know as Christians that the power that money can have over us, and Jesus talked a lot about that, right? And that's why Zacchaeus had to do that reparation, because of the power that money can have. And so we want to see that power released through reparation, that power released for good. And I think that we're already seeing reparation in some small little ways and small places, and we will continue to see that throughout our lifetimes.
Wonderful. And finally, Priya, remember you've only got a minute.
It's happening. We are seeing reparations being paid, although maybe not, exactly called reparations. We see the case of Germany and Namibia. It wasn't called reparations. The German government didn't want to phrase it as such, but it was an act of kind of, acknowledging harm caused. The US is a very particular example, with a very, unique kind of set of historical kind of, legacies around slavery. But, there is a bill within the parliament, within the government system, to establish reparations. There's all kinds of interesting examples of state level action towards recognition of reparations. So I think the examples are there, and it's about making connections and the linkages and getting inspiration kind of from the movements that are forging ahead in this area.
Right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful presentations, and also for everyone who sent in questions. Thank you so much. And if we haven't answered your question, if you leave your contact details, then we would try and get back to you. Furthermore, we're launching the Racial Justice Advocacy website in the next couple of weeks. And a lot of these questions will be answered on there, as well as other information. Let me just say, as the chair of the Movement for Justice and Reconciliation, we've actually we've done an exhibition, which is on our website, the digital version on our website, which is mjr-uk.com/exhibition. And you can see the parts that the banks played and the money that they got from the slave trade, because we believe that the legacy of slavery is still very much with us. And as someone put in the chat, for us to actually have an equitable society, we have to deal with racism. We have to deal with other injustices, because they're all interconnected: racial justice, social justice, climate justice, and so that we can repair our world. And so this is Alton Bell. from MJR. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. The conversation continues, and our next one will be in March, when we're looking at education and how we could use education as a tool to bring about social and racial reconciliation. And I would tell us, remember, as Jesus said, he's given us the ministry of reconciliation in the scriptures in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 18. And it's for us as Christians to start using our prophetic voices and our prophetic actions to change the world. 12 disciples turned the world upside down. So many of us as Christians can turn this world upside down. So thank you all for coming, and it's good night and God bless, and take care.